He thought speaking another language would make him untouchable. He never imagined the waitress understood every word. One calm reply shattered his pride and nearly cost him billions. Stay until the end, because the real twist changes everything. The snow had just started to fall over New York City. Not the heavy kind that paralyzed traffic. Just enough to soften the edges of Manhattan, to make the glass towers shimmer beneath streetlights like polished steel. Outside Le Claremont, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the financial district, a black SUV rolled to a slow, deliberate stop. The valet hurried forward. The door opened, and Victor Langston stepped out like the night belonged to him. He didn't rush. Powerful men never did. His overcoat was charcoal wool, custom-tailored, Italian stitching. Beneath it, a midnight blue suit cut so precisely it seemed engineered rather than sewn. His shoes touched the pavement with quiet authority. Heads turned, not because he was a celebrity, but because he was something rarer in New York. Untouchable. Victor Langston wasn't old money. He was worse. He was new money that had multiplied itself 10 times over. Founder and CEO of Langston Global Logistics, the company that quietly moved half the cargo flowing through East Coast ports. Tech-integrated shipping routes, AI-managed freight systems, contracts with the federal government. He had built it from nothing, and now he walked like a man who believed he had built everything. Inside the SUV, his CFO leaned forward. Press caught wind of the Singapore expansion rumor. Victor adjusted his cufflinks without looking back. Let them speculate, he said coolly. Speculation raises valuation. He stepped inside the restaurant. Warm light enveloped him. Crystal chandeliers. White tablecloths. Soft classical piano in the background. The air carried notes of truffle, butter, and aged wine. Power had a scent. And tonight it smelled expensive. The maitre d' recognized him instantly. Mr. Langston, your private table is ready. Of course it is, Victor replied, a faint smile pulling at his lips. He moved through the dining room like a silent headline. Conversations dipped slightly as patrons registered who had entered. A senator at one table. A hedge fund manager at another. Money recognized money. Victor's table sat near the panoramic window overlooking the Hudson River. Snow drifted past the glass like falling ash. Seated already were 2 international investors, one French, one Swiss, both considering funding Victor's ambitious port expansion project in Savannah and Newark. $1 billion deal. Victor thrived on rooms like this. He removed his coat and took his seat. And then she approached. Grace Johnson. She carried herself with quiet steadiness, not timid, not bold. Balanced. Her uniform was simple. Black dress, white apron, hair pulled back neatly. No dramatic jewelry. No exaggerated smile. Just composure. She stepped toward the table with a leather-bound menu in hand. Good evening, gentlemen, she said warmly. Welcome to Le Claremont. My name is Grace. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Her voice was smooth. Professional. Clear. Victor looked up slowly. His eyes moved over her in assessment. Not attraction. Evaluation. A flicker of dismissal crossed his face, so quickly most people would have missed it. Grace didn't. She had worked in fine dining long enough to recognize every variety of ego. Victor took the menu but didn't open it. Instead, he switched languages. French. Fluent. Confident. Deliberate. He began ordering in polished Parisian cadence, discussing the wine selection with exaggerated nuance. The French investor's eyebrows lifted in mild approval. Then Victor leaned slightly toward his investors and continued speaking in French. But this time, his tone shifted. Casual. Mocking. New York prides itself on diversity, he said smoothly in French. But I doubt she understands a word of this. We could be discussing nuclear codes. The Swiss investor chuckled quietly. Victor continued. It's fascinating how many Americans assume speaking one language is enough. Education standards have declined. His smile was thin, measured, strategic. Grace stood still, expression neutral, pen poised above her order pad. She did not interrupt. Victor's eyes flicked briefly toward her, searching for confusion. There was none. He went further. In France, he continued in French, even waitstaff speak at least 2 languages. Hear it well. A dismissive shrug. The investors gave restrained laughter. The kind wealthy men use when unsure whether something is truly funny. Grace finished writing the order. Then she looked up, directly at Victor. There was no anger in her eyes. No humiliation. Only something far more unsettling. Understanding. She spoke. In flawless, fluid French. Her accent wasn't American. It was precise. Parisian. Sir, she said calmly, correcting his pronunciation of Chateauneuf du Pape with subtle ease. If you prefer the 2015 vintage, I would recommend allowing it to breathe for at least 20 minutes. And yes, in France, many of us do speak multiple languages. The air shifted. Victor blinked. The French investor's posture straightened. Grace continued, still in French. And as for education standards, I assure you mine were quite rigorous. Then she switched to English. Clear enough for the entire table. You ordered the ribeye medium rare, the sea bass for monsieur, and the duck confit. A beat. And I understood everything. Silence fell over the table like a curtain. The piano music seemed suddenly louder. Victor stared at her. His confidence, the carefully curated armor, cracked just slightly. But men like Victor did not fall apart publicly. They recalibrated. A small laugh escaped him. Well, he said smoothly, reverting to English, impressive. I didn't expect that. Grace met his gaze evenly. Most people don't. There was no arrogance in her tone. Just fact. One of the investors cleared his throat. Where did you learn French like that? Grace answered without hesitation. Columbia University. Victor's fingers tightened around the stem of his wine glass. For the first time that evening, he had not controlled the room. And he hated it. Grace inclined her head politely. I'll have your wine brought out shortly. She turned and walked away, steady, unhurried, unaffected. Victor watched her go. Snow continued to fall beyond the window. And something subtle had shifted. The man who believed he owned every room he entered had just discovered. There are rooms you cannot dominate, only misunderstand. Victor did not like surprises. Surprises implied variables. Variables implied loss of control. And control was the currency he valued most. He lifted his glass slowly, buying himself a few seconds to think. The wine had just been poured by a junior sommelier, but Victor barely tasted it. His mind replayed Grace's accent. It wasn't classroom French. It wasn't memorized phrases. It was lived in, confident, effortless. Across the table, Henri Beaumont, the French investor, leaned back in his chair, studying Victor with new curiosity. You didn't mention Columbia graduates were part of the service experience here, Henri said lightly. The Swiss investor, Lucas Meyer, gave a thin smile. New York is full of contradictions. Victor forced a small chuckle. Yes, well, intelligence is everywhere. Opportunity is not. It sounded clever in his head. It sounded thinner in the air. Henri swirled his wine slowly. Still, I find it admirable. Victor's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Admiration. For a waitress. He redirected the conversation swiftly, shifting into numbers, projections, shipping routes, automated port systems. Screens were not present, but Victor didn't need slides. He spoke in figures the way other men spoke in poetry. 27% reduction in turnaround time. 42% increase in cargo throughput. Projected valuation growth within 18 months. The investors listened. They were here for money, after all. But something subtle had changed. Victor felt it. Their questions were sharper now. Not hostile, just probing. Cultural intelligence is critical for international logistics, Lucas said at one point. Especially in emerging markets. Victor nodded confidently. Which is why I make it a priority to understand global nuance. The words tasted ironic. At that moment, Grace returned with the decanter. She moved with quiet precision, setting it down gently. The candlelight reflected against the glass, casting warm ripples over the tablecloth. She poured with steady hands. No trembling. No tension. Victor watched her from the corner of his eye. He wanted to detect resentment. Bitterness. Something. But she was unreadable. When she finished pouring, Henri addressed her directly. Mademoiselle Grace, he said in French, smiling warmly. You spent time in Paris? Grace responded in French again, her tone polite but not eager. Yes, sir. A semester abroad during my undergraduate studies. Which arrondissement? Henri asked. The 5th, near the Sorbonne. Henry's eyebrows rose. Ah! Victor's throat tightened slightly. This was no lucky classroom pronunciation. This was immersion. Grace shifted back into English seamlessly. Please let me know if you need anything further. Victor stopped her before she could leave. Grace. She turned. Yes, Mr. Langston? The way she said his name, evenly, without awe, irritated him more than he expected. You said Columbia. What did you study? The question was casual on the surface. Beneath it lay something sharper. Assessment. Grace met his gaze calmly. International business and French studies. Henri let out a low whistle. Lucas looked amused. Victor leaned back slowly. And you're waiting tables. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Grace didn't flinch. Yes, sir. A beat passed. Victor tilted his head. Ambitious degree for hospitality. There it was again. The subtle attempt to diminish. Grace's expression softened. Not defensively, but knowingly. Hospitality is a global industry, she said. Language matters. Systems matter. People matter. Her eyes held his. And leadership matters. The last sentence was delivered gently. But it landed like weight. Henry's lips twitched, suppressing a smile. Victor felt heat crawl up his collar. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not in his own chosen arena. Perception. He dismissed her with a slight nod. She walked away again. Victor exhaled slowly. Impressive staff, Lucas murmured. Yes, Henri added. Very. Victor forced himself back into presentation mode. He pivoted to infrastructure projections, automation timelines, cost-benefit analysis. And gradually, the conversation regained structure. But Victor's mind was split. Half on logistics, half on Grace. He told himself it didn't matter. It was nothing. A moment. An anomaly. Yet something about the way she had held his gaze unsettled him. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was equality. And Victor Langston did not often encounter that outside boardrooms. Grace moved toward the service station, her pulse slightly elevated, but steady. She hadn't planned to reveal her fluency. Usually she let comments pass. People underestimated her all the time. It was easier that way. But tonight felt different. The casual cruelty in his tone had crossed a line. Not because it hurt, but because it revealed something. She had seen men like him before. Brilliant. Driven. Fragile beneath it. Her phone vibrated briefly in her apron pocket. A message from her mother. Did you eat before your shift? Grace smiled faintly. I will later. Rest. Love you. She slipped the phone away and returned to her section. From across the room, Victor's laughter rose, louder now compensating. Grace noticed the shift. Men who feel exposed often grow louder. She delivered plates to another table, explaining the dish with ease. But she remained aware of Victor's table. Power attracts attention. And tonight, it was cracking slightly at the edges. The main course arrived. Grace placed each dish with precision. When she set Victor's ribeye before him, she spoke softly. Medium rare as requested. Their eyes met again. There was no hostility in hers. No triumph. Just awareness. Victor cut into the steak, perfectly cooked. He nodded despite himself. Well done, he muttered. Thank you, she replied. As she stepped away, Henri leaned forward toward Victor. She carries herself like an executive, Henri said quietly. Victor's fork paused midair. Or like someone who doesn't know her place, Victor replied. The words slipped out before he could polish them. Lucas's gaze sharpened. And what place is that? Lucas asked calmly. Victor looked up. For a split second, he saw it. Judgment. Measured. Professional. Dangerous. He adjusted his tone instantly. I mean, she's clearly capable of more. That's all. Henri wiped his mouth thoughtfully. Capability should never be underestimated. Victor nodded. But the room no longer felt entirely his. The window reflected his image faintly in the glass, suited, powerful, polished. And beyond it, snow continued falling over Manhattan. Quiet. Unimpressed. For the first time in years, Victor felt something unfamiliar stir beneath his certainty. Not fear. Not yet. But awareness. He had tried to display superiority through language. Instead, language had leveled the field. And somewhere across the dining room, Grace Johnson moved calmly through candlelight. Unbothered. Unshaken. And entirely unimpressed by his billions. Victor lifted his wine again, but this time, the taste was different. Less smooth. More bitter. And though he would never admit it aloud, he knew something had shifted. The night was no longer about a billion-dollar deal. It had become something else. A quiet contest. Of character. And he had not won the opening round. The rest of the dinner should have been routine. Numbers. Strategy. Charm. Victor Langston had salvaged worse situations than an unexpectedly multilingual waitress. But the problem wasn't what Grace had said. It was what she had revealed. Control, once questioned, rarely returned untouched. By dessert, the energy at the table had shifted in ways Victor could not fully recalibrate. Henri Beaumont no longer leaned in with admiration, he observed. Lucas Meyer asked more measured questions. Less about projected revenue, more about international labor relationships. Cultural adaptability, Lucas said, slicing into his tart tatin, is critical when expanding into multilingual regions. Victor smiled thinly. Of course. And humility, Henri added casually, is equally valuable. Victor's fork paused. Humility. The word hovered. Grace approached again, clearing plates with steady hands. Victor watched her carefully this time. Not dismissively. Analytically. She moved through the dining room with quiet authority. Other tables responded to her warmly. She anticipated requests before they were voiced. She listened fully when spoken to. No rushing. No fawning. Just presence. Victor found it unsettling. Because it was the kind of presence he cultivated deliberately. Yet hers seemed effortless. When coffee was served, Victor made a decision. He would shift the tone. Reassert dominance subtly. As Grace set down the espresso cups, Victor leaned back and switched languages again. Mandarin this time. His pronunciation was less fluid than his French, but competent enough. He spoke quietly to Henri and Lucas. In business, he said in Mandarin, you must test people. Pressure reveals capability. He assumed she wouldn't understand. Mandarin was rarer. More strategic. He continued. Sometimes you apply tension just to see who bends. Grace paused mid-pour. Just briefly. So brief most would have missed it. But Victor noticed. Her hand did not shake. Her breathing did not change. She finished pouring. Then she set the coffee pot down gently and replied in clear, careful Mandarin. Pressure can also reveal who breaks. Silence detonated softly across the table. Lucas nearly choked on his espresso. Henri blinked twice. Victor stared at her openly now. No mask. No smirk. How many languages do you speak? Henri asked, stunned. Grace returned to English calmly. Enough to understand when I'm being discussed. Her tone held no hostility. Only clarity. Victor's jaw tightened. He had not anticipated this. Testing someone was safe when you believed they lacked tools. But Grace had tools. And she wielded them without aggression. That was what destabilized him most. She was not fighting him. She was simply matching him. The exchange had not gone entirely unnoticed. A couple seated 2 tables away had slowed their conversation. A man near the bar, discreetly dressed, appeared to have been recording earlier portions of the evening on his phone. Not maliciously, just curiously. In Manhattan, power dynamics were entertainment. Victor felt the weight of observation. He stood slightly, adjusting his jacket. That will be all, Grace. The dismissal was sharper than necessary. Grace inclined her head. Of course, Mr. Langston. She walked away without hesitation. But the damage lingered. Henri folded his napkin deliberately. She is exceptional, he said plainly. Victor forced a smile. An impressive employee. Henri shook his head slowly. No, not just employee. Presence. Lucas nodded. You can learn much about leadership by observing how someone treats those they assume are powerless. The sentence hung heavy. Victor's tone cooled. Gentlemen, I treat everyone according to their role. Henry's eyes sharpened. That is precisely the point. Victor's pulse ticked upward. He had navigated hostile boardrooms, federal audits, competitive sabotage. But this was different. This was moral scrutiny. And moral scrutiny had no balance sheet. Across the service corridor, Grace leaned briefly against the wall. Not from exhaustion. From reflection. She hadn't intended to escalate the evening. But she refused to shrink. She thought about her mother at home in Brooklyn, recovering slowly after surgery. About the tuition loans she had nearly paid off. About her unfinished prototype, the hospitality AI platform she had been building quietly at night. Language recognition systems. Customer flow analytics. Cultural personalization features for international travelers. She understood logistics more than most executives realized. Because hospitality and logistics were cousins. Both required precision. Both required respect. She straightened her posture. Returned to the floor. Unbothered. When the check arrived, Victor signed it briskly. A generous tip. But impersonal. Before Grace could walk away, Lucas spoke gently. Grace. She turned. If you don't mind my asking, why wait tables with your education? Victor watched closely. It was the question he had implied earlier. But Lucas's tone held curiosity, not condescension. Grace answered evenly. Because it funds what I'm building. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. And what is that? Henri asked. Grace hesitated only a fraction. A hospitality logistics platform. AI-driven optimization for restaurants handling multilingual clientele. The table went silent again. Victor felt a flicker of disbelief. Lucas leaned forward. You're developing software? Yes, sir. For independent establishments? And chains. Henri smiled slowly. Ambitious. Victor's voice cut in smoothly. The tech space is unforgiving. Grace met his gaze without hostility. So is arrogance. The word was delivered gently, but unmistakably. Victor felt the air thin. Henri did not hide his smile this time. Lucas glanced at Victor thoughtfully. Grace added calmly, I've learned more about operational inefficiencies in dining rooms than most consultants could in years. It wasn't boastful. It was observational. Victor stood. The dinner was over. But something far more significant had begun. Outside, the snow had thickened. Victor stepped into the cold air, his mind louder than the city traffic. His CFO hurried beside him. Sir, that was unexpected. Victor remained silent. Behind him, through the restaurant window, he could see Grace moving between tables. Unshaken. Focused. The image unsettled him. He had intended to demonstrate superiority. Instead, he had revealed insecurity. He entered the SUV, door closing softly behind him. As the vehicle pulled away, his phone buzzed. A message from Henri. We will discuss tomorrow. I have thoughts. Victor stared at the screen. He knew what that meant. Reevaluation. And in billion-dollar negotiations, reevaluation was dangerous. Grace stepped outside briefly during her break. Snowflakes landed softly on her hair. The city lights reflected against the Hudson. She exhaled slowly. Not triumphant. Not angry. Just thoughtful. Her phone buzzed. A message from Professor Caldwell, her former Columbia mentor. Have you finalized your pitch deck? Investors reviewing hospitality tech next week. Grace smiled faintly. She typed back. Almost ready. She looked back through the restaurant window. For a moment, she saw Victor's reflection fading as his SUV disappeared down the street. She did not feel small. She did not feel victorious. She felt certain. Underestimation was common. but temporary. And tonight, something subtle had shifted. Not just in that dining room, but in the trajectory of two very different futures. The next morning, Manhattan looked indifferent. Steel towers reflected pale winter sunlight. Ferries crossed the Hudson as they always did. Markets opened. Screens flickered green and red. But in the corner office of Langston Global Logistics, something felt different. Victor Langston stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his headquarters in Lower Manhattan, hands clasped behind his back. He had replayed the dinner at Le Claremont 3 times before sunrise. Not because he cared about the waitress, but because he cared about leverage. And he sensed instinctively that leverage had shifted. Behind him, his CFO, Daniel Reeves, cleared his throat gently. Henri requested the meeting be moved up, Daniel said. They want to talk before reviewing final numbers. Victor didn't turn. About projections? Daniel hesitated. I believe about leadership optics. Victor's jaw hardened. Optics. A word that meant perception. And perception influenced valuation. Across town at the Conrad Hotel, Henri Beaumont and Lucas Meyer sat with espresso between them. Henri tapped his finger against the table. Last night told us more than the spreadsheets, he said quietly. Lucas nodded. Intelligence without humility becomes liability. Henri looked out at the skyline. Global expansion requires cultural dexterity, not dominance. They were not offended men. They were strategic men. And strategy required reading character. Would you trust him to negotiate in markets where respect is currency? Lucas asked. Henri didn't answer immediately. That depends, he said finally, on whether he can learn. By noon, Victor was seated at the head of a long walnut conference table. Henri and Lucas appeared on the large screen via secure video conference. Victor began smoothly. Gentlemen, before we proceed, I want to reaffirm the numbers. Savannah Port Automation alone yields. Henri raised a hand. Victor, he said calmly, we would like to discuss leadership culture. The interruption was rare. Victor's fingers interlocked slowly. Go on. Lucas leaned forward on screen. When entering emerging markets, cultural sensitivity isn't optional. It's strategic necessity. Victor kept his expression neutral. I agree. Henri continued, measured. Last night, we observed an exchange. Victor didn't blink. A restaurant interaction, Henri clarified. Small in scale, large in implication. The room felt cooler. Victor chose his words carefully. If you're referring to the waitress, it was a harmless test. Henry's gaze sharpened. Tests reveal more about the examiner than the subject. Silence. Daniel shifted uncomfortably at the far end of the table. Victor leaned back. With respect, gentlemen, my company's performance metrics speak louder than a dinner anecdote. Lucas responded evenly. In global business, character is a metric. The words landed heavier than any accusation. Victor felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not fear. Threat. Because they weren't threatening withdrawal. They were reconsidering. And reconsideration in billion-dollar deals could cost years. Henri folded his hands. We are not withdrawing, he said calmly. But we are delaying final commitment pending further evaluation. Victor's pulse ticked upward. Evaluation of what? Leadership adaptability. The call ended minutes later. Professional. Polite. Devastating. Grace sat at her small kitchen table, laptop open, sunlight filtering through thin curtains. Her mother rested in the next room. On the screen, her pitch deck. Title slide. Cultura Sync, AI-driven multilingual hospitality optimization. She reviewed her slides carefully. Real-time language recognition. Cultural dining preference analytics. Staff training integration. Operational efficiency mapping. Years of observation distilled into code and research. Her phone buzzed. Professor Caldwell. Grace, he said warmly over speakerphone. The venture group reviewing logistics-adjacent tech includes some serious capital. She smiled faintly. I'm ready. There's one more thing, he added. One of the firms considering port automation investments is in the same circle. Grace paused. Langston Global? she asked quietly. Yes. She absorbed that. The world was smaller than people realized. Will that affect my evaluation? She asked. Professor Caldwell chuckled softly. Only if you let it. Grace closed her laptop gently. She had no interest in revenge. But she understood timing. Back at his office, Victor paced slowly. The delay unsettled him more than outright rejection would have. Rejection could be countered. Delay implied doubt. He replayed Grace's words in Mandarin. Pressure can also reveal who breaks. He hated how accurately they echoed now. Daniel entered cautiously. PR flagged something, he said. Victor turned sharply. What? A short clip from last night. Nothing explosive, but circulating quietly on a private investor forum. Victor's stomach tightened. What clip? Daniel hesitated. The French exchange. Victor closed his eyes briefly. Is it damaging? Not directly. But the comments are questioning tone. Tone. In a city built on ambition, tone had become currency. Victor straightened his jacket. Schedule a follow-up dinner. Same investors. Daniel blinked. Sir, I will not be evaluated like a candidate. He paused, then added quieter. I will recalibrate. 2 days later, Grace arrived at Columbia University's Business Innovation Lab for her pitch. The room was modest but filled with sharp minds. Investors, analysts, entrepreneurs. Among them sat a familiar face from the restaurant, Lucas Meyer. Grace recognized him immediately. He recognized her too, but neither acknowledged it openly. Professional settings required neutrality. When her turn came, Grace stood before the screen. No apron, no uniform, just a navy blazer and quiet confidence. She began in English, then, seamlessly, introduced part of her pitch in French, explaining how Cultura could enhance multinational restaurant chains across European markets. The room listened intently. Lucas leaned back slightly, impressed, not because she had embarrassed Victor, but because her intelligence was structured, strategic, measured. When she finished, applause filled the room. During Q&A, one investor asked, "What inspired this concept?" Grace answered honestly, "Underestimation." The room chuckled lightly. She continued, "When you observe operations from the floor, you see inefficiencies executives miss." Lucas asked a question last. "Do you believe leadership temperament affects operational performance?" Grace met his eyes calmly. "Yes." "Why?" "Because culture flows downward." The room grew thoughtful. Lucas nodded slowly. He did not mention Victor. He did not need to. That evening, Victor received another email. Subject line: Investment Review Update. He opened it immediately. The message was brief. Pending further discussions, final commitment is conditional upon leadership advisory integration and ethics oversight framework. In simpler terms, they didn't trust him fully. He exhaled slowly. Across the city, Grace received a different message. Subject line: Seed funding consideration, Cultura Sync. She read it once. Then again. Her eyes softened. Momentum. Not revenge. Progress. Victor stood alone in his office, watching the city lights flicker on. He had built an empire through dominance. But dominance had limits in a world that now measured tone as carefully as profit. Across Brooklyn, Grace sat at her kitchen table beside her mother, reading through funding terms. Different rooms. Different power. Same city. The snow from earlier in the week had melted. But something else had frozen into place. Victor now understood that power was no longer unquestioned. And Grace understood that opportunity often arrived disguised as insult. The contest had evolved. It was no longer about a dinner. It was about trajectory. And the balance was shifting. Spring arrived in New York City without ceremony. The snow was gone. The Hudson moved with quiet determination. Construction cranes pierced the skyline like permanent declarations of ambition. In the months since that winter dinner at Le Claremont, both Victor Langston and Grace Johnson had moved forward. But forward did not mean unchanged. Victor sat in the same corner office, but the atmosphere had shifted. The delay from Henri and Lucas had turned into conditions. Not rejection. Not collapse. Correction. Langston Global would receive its funding, but only after implementing executive cultural intelligence training, independent ethics oversight, a leadership advisory integration, public-facing corporate responsibility initiatives. Victor had never needed oversight before. He built oversight for others. Yet now investors required it of him. Daniel stood across the desk. Markets are reacting positively to the governance changes, he said carefully. Analysts are calling it a modernization move. Victor stared out at the skyline. Modernization. He understood the translation. Supervised. He exhaled slowly. Schedule the advisory sessions. Daniel hesitated. Sir? Victor turned. Adaptation is not weakness, he said evenly. It's survival. But the truth beneath that statement was more complicated. He had not nearly lost billions because of incompetence. He had nearly lost them because of ego. And ego was far more difficult to audit. Across the East River in Brooklyn, Grace stood inside a modest co-working space surrounded by exposed brick walls and whiteboards filled with diagrams. Cultura Sync had officially secured seed funding. Not massive, not headline-grabbing, but enough. Enough to hire 2 developers. Enough to begin beta testing in 3 independent Manhattan restaurants. Enough to move from idea to execution. Professor Caldwell stood beside her during the small launch gathering. You handled that investor panel brilliantly, he said. Grace smiled lightly. I just told the truth. Lucas Meyer had joined the funding group quietly. He had not mentioned Victor. He had not needed to. He believed in metrics. And Grace's metrics were strong. But what impressed him most was composure under pressure. Grace's mother attended the launch, sitting proudly near the back. No spotlight. No spectacle. Just steady pride. One evening, several weeks after Cultura Sync's soft launch, Grace took a late shift at Le Claremont. She hadn't left completely. Not yet. Building something sustainable required caution. The restaurant buzzed with familiar energy. And then the maitre d' approached her quietly. Grace, Mr. Langston is requesting you. She paused. Not startled. Just aware. Thank you, she said calmly. Victor sat alone this time. No investors. No CFO. No performance. He looked composed. But not armored. Grace approached. Good evening, Mr. Langston. He stood as she arrived. A small gesture, but noticeable. Grace, he said. No foreign language. No testing tone. I owe you something. The dining room noise continued around them, but their table felt still. You owe me nothing, Grace replied evenly. I owe you an apology. The word came slower than numbers ever did for him. She waited. I was dismissive, he continued. And arrogant. He did not dress it up. Did not excuse it. Grace studied him carefully. This was not the Victor from that snowy evening. That Victor had needed the room to see him. This one seemed less concerned with witnesses. I appreciate that, she said softly. He nodded once. I underestimated you. Grace's expression remained steady. A lot of people do. The words were factual, not resentful. Victor almost smiled. Yes, he said. I've discovered that recently. A subtle reference. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. I heard about your company, he added. Cultura Sync. Grace blinked once. News travels. It does. He hesitated. For what it's worth. I was wrong. The simplicity of it surprised even him. Grace inclined her head slightly. Growth requires correction, she said. Their eyes met. No hostility. No triumph. Just recognition. Victor left a generous tip again. But this time, it felt less like compensation. More like acknowledgement. Weeks later, Langston Global publicly announced its new cultural leadership initiative. Financial media framed it as progressive evolution. Investors responded favorably. Stock prices stabilized. Victor attended executive training sessions quietly. He listened more. Spoke less. It felt foreign at first, but effective. Meanwhile, Cultura Sync secured its first major partnership, a boutique Manhattan restaurant group seeking multilingual integration before expanding internationally. Grace stood at the head of a conference table this time, explaining analytics dashboards, demonstrating AI response modeling. Investors listened. Staff took notes. She was no longer moving between tables. She was building them. 6 months after that snowy evening, both Victor and Grace found themselves in Chicago for a global hospitality and logistics conference. Coincidence? Or inevitability? Victor was scheduled to speak on sustainable port expansion. Grace had been invited to present on AI integration in multilingual hospitality systems. Different panels. Same event. Victor finished his presentation first. Polished. Measured. Less aggressive than before. He stepped off stage to polite applause. Later that afternoon, Grace took the podium in a mid-sized auditorium. She wore a tailored charcoal suit. Her voice carried clearly. She opened her presentation in English, then shifted briefly into French, explaining how cultural nuance directly impacts operational efficiency. The audience leaned in. She moved confidently through data, projections, live demos. Not flashy, not loud, just precise. Victor entered quietly near the back halfway through her talk. He did not announce himself. He did not interrupt. He simply listened. When she concluded, applause filled the room. Stronger than polite. Earned. Grace stepped down from the stage. Their eyes met across the aisle. No tension. No scoreboard. Just mutual understanding. Victor gave a small nod. Respect. Grace returned it. Acknowledgement. They did not speak. They did not need to. The lesson had already unfolded. Power is loud when it feels secure. But true power does not need to humiliate to prove itself. Victor had believed language made him superior. But language had only revealed his insecurity. Grace had never needed revenge. She needed opportunity. And when opportunity met preparation, the balance shifted naturally. In the end, neither of them lost everything. But one of them learned that respect travels further than arrogance. And the other proved that underestimation is temporary, when confidence is permanent. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, and subscribe to Boundless Echoes for more interesting stories. We really appreciate your support. Comment where you are watching from, so we can give you a shout out. See you in our next video.